So some really interesting points there from Dr. Orla Keane. Orla, if I turn to you, in the video you mentioned the development of anthelmintic resistance and that now it's been detected on cattle farms. Can you tell the listeners, what do we mean by anthelmintic resistance?
Okay, so I suppose there's been a lot of talk recently, and you would have heard this morning, and as Frank mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of talk lately around antimicrobial resistance, where bacteria develop resistance to the products that we use to treat them. But similarly, worms, parasitic worms, can also develop resistance to the products that we use to treat them. So anthelmintic resistance refers to worms that can survive a dose or a treatment with an anthelmintic, with a wormer that normally kills them. So this has been known for quite some time that there's been anthelmintic resistance on sheep farms in Ireland, but it was believed to be more rare on cattle farms. However, some of the recent research that we've carried out here at Grange has shown that anthelmintic resistance is more common on cattle farms than we previously thought, and that the level of resistance to the different classes of anthelmintics, the three classes that were mentioned there earlier, the white wormers, the yellow wormers and the clear wormers, that the level of resistance to these products is different, and of course it will be a property of the farm. So again, very much coming back to the point that Frank made earlier about how parasite control plans really need to be tailored for the farm in question.
Okay, and is it an issue for gutworms, or is it lungworms, or is it both, or where do you see a greater issue there?
Yeah, so all of the work that we've done to date has looked at resistance in gutworm populations. So as I mentioned, we found quite high, surprisingly high levels of resistance in the gutworms. In terms of lungworm, there's been very few studies that have looked at resistance in lungworm, and there's a few reasons for that. It's very, very difficult to carry out the test for lungworm, and quite often when lungworm causes disease, it's in the pre-patent period, so this is before any of the larvae are shed in the dung. Anecdotally, there have been some stories of failure of the products for the treatment of lungworm, but it would appear that any resistance that's out there for lungworm is much more rare, and that most of the cases of resistance that we're seeing are in the gutworms. Okay,
and based on your research carried out at Teagasc Grange, have we been able to identify the risk factors on certain farms? So what let's say, encourages, if you like, the development of anthelmintic resistance on farms?
Yeah, so there's a number of factors that we know can accelerate the development of anthelmintic resistance. So I suppose one of the factors that we know is the current resistance status. So if we, anthelmintic, the development of resistance is effectively like a slippery slope. It goes slowly at the start, but then it accelerates. So obviously if you don't have resistance or very low levels of resistance, that's the time to implement the strategies to slow it down. Another factor that we know is important is how many times you treat. So the more you use the product, every time you use the product, you give the resistant worms a selective advantage over the susceptible worms. So treating unnecessarily and when it's not required, that's a huge risk factor for the development of resistance. A third factor is underdosing. So if you expose the worms to not enough of the drug to kill them, that will also lead to the development of resistance. And then the fourth factor is a factor, it's quite a complex factor, but it's the refugia factor. So what refugia means is it's the proportion of worms in the population that are not exposed to the drug. So these are generally in worms on pasture or worms in animals that aren't treated. So these worms are under no selective pressure to develop resistance. They provide susceptible genes that will breed with the resistant worms and dilute the effect of resistance. And of course, in suckler systems, a great source of refugia can be the mature cows.
Okay, so that's interesting. So part of our objective then, as part of a dosing program, is to maintain a population of worms in the pasture.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose, as resistance develops to these products, as we outlined there, despite the large number of products on the market, there's really only 3 classes. So it's very important that we preserve the efficacy of the 3 classes that we have. And so, the solution now is much more about planning and including a parasite control plan as part of your herd health plan that will allow you to reduce the amount of wormer that you use. And it is about, you want some worms, you need exposure of the calves to some worms in order for them to develop their immunity. So it's about managing that exposure so that their immunity develops, but they do not suffer production loss or clinical disease.
Okay, and Frank O'Sullivan, as a veterinary practitioner, have you seen this rearing its head on farms? Have you seen anthelmintic resistance, appearing on farms, and how is it manifesting itself?
Well, certainly we've been familiar with the sheep farmers for a number of years that this has been a big issue. And it's becoming more and more common now on cattle farms, both beef and dairy cross animals being reared. So, well, the best way I can describe this is to give you an example of a case I saw at the weekend where we had a farmer, his suckler calves were just starting to cough. We had taken a fecal sample from them a week ago, and the worm count was extremely low. So now we're in a bit of a dilemma, because is this cough as a result of, if you like, immature lungworm that are migrating through the lungs, causing a reaction, causing an issue, but haven't yet matured in the airways, if you like, and therefore no eggs have been laid by adult lungworm. So the point here is, of course, that the fecal egg test doesn't forewarn us about the possibility of lungworm. So that's why the farmer would be key here to be herding his animals and listening for that. If they were previously healthy and now we are in a coughing situation and no other obvious reason, we would suspect lungworm and we would feel, warranted in moving in to treat those animals. Now, there are some tests we can do. We can do some tracheal washes for lungworm and find those evidence of the lungworm there, or even fecal samples after a while. But for us in practice, the key one is the differential diagnosis. Is this the tail end of a respiratory viral syndrome, or is it a lungworm issue that's emerging? And they're the balances we make. And to come to a conclusion in those, we often, with the farmer, examine the animals, take our time to think about them, and then use some confirmatory tests, and then plan the way ahead.
I suppose, Orla, for many of the farmers watching in this evening, and Frank has alluded to, the differential diagnosis and trying to identify, the correct treatment. I suppose what farmers want to know is what product to use, how much of that product to use, and I suppose it's following the guidance that's provided. So what is the advice around that?
So, previous advice would have been to rotate products that you use, and that is still good advice where you know that all the products are effective. But what's really important is to use a product that works. So that really involves, coming back to the point Frank made earlier about testing. It's really, really important to test so you know what products work on your farm, and then rotate among the products that work. But if any of the products are failing or failing quite significantly, they may need to be dropped out of the rotation because they're no longer doing the job, they're no longer killing the worms, and it's leaving the animals still exposed to those worms, and it will probably encourage the development of further resistance. So in terms of the product to use, we get asked this question a lot: when will I dose and what will I dose with? And of course, you dose with something that works, and the only way you'll know what works is by testing.
Okay, so it was previously advised to rotate wormers.
Yes.
Is that still the case, or are we saying now if it's working, to maintain the same dose?
Rotate within the products that are working, within the classes that are working. As I mentioned, there's 3 classes. There's a large number of products on the market, but they fall into one of these 3 classes: the white, the yellow, and the clear wormers. So rotate the classes that still work on your farm. So of course, if that's all of them, then rotate among all of them. Okay. And just in relation again to previous advice, dose and move, is that still the advice, or what are we saying around that? Yeah, so I suppose the advice in terms of dosing is not to dose and move to clean pasture, because this comes back to this point I made earlier about refugia. So if you treat all of the animals in a herd, and then you move them to clean pasture, so after grass or something like that, where there's very few worms on the pasture, then you very little refugia. Most of the worms have been exposed to the drug, and any that have survived will be resistant, and they will shed eggs out onto that pasture. So in terms of dose and move, we would say don't dose and move to clean pasture. I mean, if you're rotational grazing and you're not moving to clean pasture, that's a different story.
So rotate within the grazing rotation that you already have established for that group of animals.
Yeah.
And how long would you think before you move to a clean pasture? How long after dosing do you retain on that grazing rotation?
Yeah. So for products that have no persistent activity, up to a week should be fine, because it will allow them to pick up some more worms some susceptible worms from the pasture that haven't been exposed to the drug before they go on to the clean pasture. Obviously, if you're using product with a persistent activity, then that will be different, and it will depend on the period of persistence.
Okay, you've touched on products with persistent activity. Can you tell those joining us here this evening a little bit more about those products, and are there any specific considerations we need to bear in mind in respect of those products?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a number of products that have persistent activity, and some of them can have quite long persistent activity, and they can be quite popular because, you know, people feel that now they have their worm burdens under control and they don't need to worry about it for a long period of time. The one thing I would say, I suppose, about these products is that they should be used carefully, because again, it comes back to this refugia story. If you treat with a product with a long period of persistency, any incoming worms for that period of persistency will continue to be killed by the wormer. So any resistant worms have that whole period of persistency in which they can reproduce and contaminate the pasture with resistant eggs, while the susceptible worms continue to be killed. So if resistance starts to develop, using a product with a long period of persistency will accelerate that development.
Okay.
Also, as the product tails off in the system, you know, you can have an effect similar to underdosing because they're long period of persistency and then they tail off at the end. You can have, you know, subtherapeutic amounts of the drug towards the end.
Okay, so I guess it's again about, you know, communication with your veterinary
Absolutely.
practitioner and watching your hair-to-head planning process.
Yeah, so it's about planning this process.
Frank, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just picking up on Orla's point. So what has changed, you know, taking the advice from James O'Shaughnessy and Orla's research in Teagasc, is that if we're sampling now, we do certainly a sampling during the season, but we also do a key fecal sampling maybe 10 days, 2 weeks after dosing to see have the worms been removed from the animals. That gives us the confidence that there's still an activity there that's required.
Okay, and we've seen, of course, as part of the social media videos that went out today, the whole process for fecal egg counts and for sending in those samples. Of course, they're part of BEEP, but they're also part of good practice on farms. So we would encourage, I suppose, fecal egg count and using that as an additional tool in our strategy to control parasite burden on farms. I suppose, Orla, you mentioned earlier, just in respect of the Derry Patrick herd, you know, the long dry spell and how that influences, I suppose, the parasite control plan we have had. Just in terms of samples coming in from, if you like, commercial farms, what have we seen this year and how has the weather patterns affected the type of parasite burdens we've seen?
Yeah, so we did tend to see over the spring parasite burden stayed low. As long as the weather was dry, the parasite burden stay low. Now they do tend to be much lower in suckler systems anyway than, let's say, in calf to beef systems. They do tend to stay low. So they do stay low. You do tend to see a jump about probably within the egg count. You'll probably see it 3 to 4 weeks after a significant period of rain.
Okay, thank you, Orla. Really fascinating discussion around parasite burden and the parasite control plan on farms.